I am a single guy in my 30s, and this story happened a few years ago during a rather dark time in my life. At the time, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of 5 years, the person I believed would build a happy family with me. It was a difficult time. I felt lost, and there was no denying that the emotional trauma of the breakup was deep. I neglected myself for days, lying in bed, waking up without talking to anyone, going to work in a daze, then going back to my room for the rest of the day. Weekends were even worse. I forgot to eat and didn't leave the house. I just lay there, watching one movie after another, not caring what I was watching. But enough was enough. That period of relaxation and self-torment was over. I'm doing better now, although I still sometimes think about the life I could have had if things had gone differently. Back to a dreary Saturday night, I was lying on the couch, doing nothing but pressing play on a nonsensical action movie whose name I couldn't even remember. It was just a piece of light entertainment that I would forget almost immediately after watching. My room was on the second floor, with a couch and a TV in the corner of the bedroom. As such, I hardly ever left my room to watch TV anywhere else in the house. That night, while I was lying there watching a movie, my phone rang. The clock was a few minutes after 9 p.m. I remembered the time because it was the 4th time my mother had called that day. I didn't want to ignore her, but I also wasn't in the mood to talk. The ringing continued, but I ignored it. I knew she was worried about me, wanting to ask if I had eaten or gone out, but I didn't want to answer anything at that moment. When I lost my patience with the movie, I went back to the selection menu and randomly clicked on a horror movie I had never heard of. The title had a mysterious, blurry thumbnail. I thought I would just watch a little bit until I got tired and fell asleep. But even after watching for about 20 minutes, the movie was even worse than I had anticipated. The sound quality was terrible. Every time the character spoke, I had to turn the volume all the way up to make out a few words, and then I was tortured by the deafening musical effects that almost shook the speaker membranes. Strangely enough, however, I continued watching, mostly because I was too bored to choose another, but also because I was curious to see where this terrible movie would end up. Then I started to notice a strange sound that kept repeating itself in the movie, a sharp metallic sound, like a steel pipe hitting concrete. The sound was completely out of sync with anything that was happening on screen. There was no one holding metal, and there was no context for what looked like a wear. The noise also appeared out of time, with any dramatic scene popping up every minute or so, as if the director had accidentally added it or there was a technical glitch. The sound was so consistent in pitch and volume that it was hard to believe it was the result of sloppy sound design. Combined with the rest of the film's terrible soundtrack, I wondered how it had made it to streaming. The awfulness of it all made it even harder for me to look away, partly because I wanted to understand the story. I stood there trying to calm myself down and make sure that what was happening wasn't just my imagination. I stared at the paused screen and listened intently, hoping that my mind was playing tricks on me, but not long after, about 45 seconds had passed, the sound came again, exactly as before. Without wasting any more time, I jumped up, grabbed the knife on the table, and went to check each room, with a frantic anxiety, probing every corner that might be hidden by someone. However, all the rooms were empty, no sign of anything unusual. Despite the fact that nothing happened, the feeling of unease followed me as I walked back up the stairs. With my heart still pounding, the sound came again, this time softer than before. It seemed to be coming from the room where I was watching the movie. It didn't make sense since I was there the whole time. Then I remembered that I had opened a few windows earlier. It was a cool spring day, and I had a habit of letting the cool breeze in at night. I began to think that maybe the sound wasn't coming from inside the house, but from outside. The idea that the sound was coming from outside only added to my fear. I went to the window and parted the curtains to look out into the backyard. In the middle of the lawn, about 20 feet from the house, a folding chair was placed there, and next to it was a small child. The darkness made it hard to see his features, but his figure was definitely not that of an adult. He was holding something that looked like a piece of PVC pipe, which would explain the noise. He must have seen me because as soon as my eyes turned to the window, he immediately slammed the pipe into the chair. I recoiled from the window, fear spreading through my body. As silly as it may sound to be afraid of a small child, I couldn't stop thinking about the boy's strange behavior outside my house. Was he mentally disturbed? Then the thought that he had been standing there for an hour deepened the fear. I tried to calm myself by coming up with a more plausible explanation. Could the child have gotten lost? Could he have gone for a walk from his house nearby and didn't know how to get back? I couldn't just stand there and ignore it, so I decided to go downstairs and head for the back door, intending to investigate. I turned on the porch light, hoping that would make the boy feel better, or at least give me a better view. But as soon as I put my hand on the doorknob, I stopped. A feeling of unease crept in, as if I were walking into a trap. If the child had really gotten lost, would he have knocked or called out to me from the window? And even if he was too scared to act out of the blue by slamming the plastic into a chair, would he persist in that bizarre act for an hour? Something deep inside me told me not to go out. I retreated slowly from the door and tiptoed to a small window next to it that overlooked part of the backyard. I turned off the lights around me to avoid attracting attention and used 2 fingers to gently part the curtain enough to peer through. Outside, not only was there the boy, but also 2 men in black hiding under the back porch, looking like they were about to ambush me as soon as I opened the door. I stood there staring for too long before one of them turned and their eyes met mine through the glass. Panicking, I dropped the curtain and immediately called 911. As I ran up the stairs, a loud bang echoed behind me. I yelled that the police were coming. Immediately, the person on the other side of the door ran down the stairs. A few seconds later, I heard a door slam and then everything went quiet. The police arrived shortly after and I told them what had happened. However, there was not much they could do because I had no video or pictures to show nor any useful information. The only thing that made them take the matter more seriously was the fact that a child was involved. The police followed the thin lines, but that only made it clear that these people were not just impulsive criminals. They had a clear plan and were determined to go further, which was the scariest thing to me. I didn't want to think about the poor child, lest I feel even more depressed. Every explanation I imagined for the story made me feel the same way. The police concluded that it was likely a random attack. But to me, the whole thing was too planned and calculated to be a mere coincidence. From that day on, things went quiet, and I went on with my life. I just hoped that the child was somehow safe, though I knew the chances were slim. The year is 2024. As I write this, I am a senior in high school, just a few weeks away from graduating. By the way, let me tell you a short story. I have never understood how my friends survived their week-long spring breaks in Miami or other party spots. I'm simply not that type of person. Throughout my college years, spring break was always an excuse to go home and relax. This past spring break was no exception. It was always a time for me to completely disconnect for a week to recharge after a stressful week of homework and trivial school matters. Truth be told, I was pretty pissed because I had just filed a detailed midterm review which the teaching assistant had rejected without any valid reason. In any case, I had no plans that Monday morning other than to go to the gym, a routine that helped maintain a sense of stability in my life. Even though I was on spring break and not under any pressure, I set my alarm for 6 a.m. to keep up with my routine. Around 6:20 a.m. I got dressed and left the house. I started the 15-minute drive to the gym, mostly through small, quiet residential streets. Gloomy but perfect for growing up, though a little dull as my friends slowly left for their new lives. I was driving, listening to some music on YouTube when I noticed something odd. There was an ice cream truck parked on the side of the road. There was no sound from the engine, no lights on. The kids were still in school because it was mid-March, and the air was still chilly. There was no reason for an ice cream truck to show up at 6:30 in the morning. As I drove past the truck, a strange feeling came over me. I slowed down, glanced out the window, and realized it was completely empty. Then I turned the corner, leaving it behind, but the thought of the truck lingered in my mind more than I had expected. And I didn't know why the sight of it bothered me so much. Maybe it was because it was so out of place. This neighborhood had never had ice cream trucks like that, not even when I was a kid. It was hard to explain because the strangeness wasn't so much that it was so early in the day, but that the truck didn't belong there. I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on my workout. After my workout, I grabbed a quick snack, feeling good that I had made good use of my morning. But when I returned to the neighborhood, the truck was still in the same spot. This made me pause for a moment. In a sensitive neighborhood like this one, where people are often uncomfortable with strange cars staying in front of their homes for too long, it was surprising that the truck hadn't been reported. I remembered that the last time my friend had parked in front of a difficult woman's house, she had criticized us. So I really didn't think I was being paranoid and expecting someone to call the police on this truck. Out of curiosity, I decided to circle around it again to check if anyone was inside. As I drove past again, moving so slowly that it was probably obvious, a man in the driver's seat turned his head and stared at me. He was a strange-looking man with a long, pointed, cartoon nose and a scraggly, careless beard. He had the air of someone who lived in his car, which made me uneasy. I drove straight home and continued my day in peace. That afternoon, when I went down to check my mail, I was stunned to find that the truck had moved and was parked just a few houses away from my house. Although it wasn't facing my house directly, it was hard to see it as a coincidence. Why would that person follow me home? Anxiety began to set in. I quickly returned home, trying to act like I hadn't noticed anything. I went upstairs and stood in the living room, which had a better view of the street, and pulled back the curtains to look at the truck. It was still there. I watched patiently for a few minutes, but nothing unusual happened. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but my curiosity wouldn't let me stop looking at it. Still, I knew I had to let it go and try to do something else on my laptop to distract myself from the uneasiness. However, my concentration was always broken by a strong urge to go back to the window to check. Every time I glanced through the blinds, the same thing happened. The truck was still there, but its position seemed to have changed slightly, indicating that the driver had deliberately moved it around the area for reasons I couldn't fathom. I wondered whether to call the police, worried that they wouldn't take my report seriously since nothing concrete had happened. I should have just ignored it and gone about my day like everyone else. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I remembered my brother's binoculars, which were hidden somewhere in his room. He loved birdwatching. After some searching, I finally found them and went back to the living room. Carefully pulling back the blinds, I raised the binoculars and aimed them at the truck. I was not prepared for what I saw outside the driver's window. From my vantage point, I saw the same man I'd seen before, but he wasn't just sitting there. He was staring straight at me through his binoculars. When he realized I was paying attention to him, he lowered the binoculars, started the truck, and drove away. My heart almost stopped, terrified that he had been watching me and my house for 3 hours after following me home. That's when I couldn't take it anymore and decided to call the police, even though I honestly didn't know what I was hoping for. I told the police that the ice cream truck had been driving around the neighborhood all day, that a man inside had been watching my house through his binoculars, and that he had left as soon as he realized I had seen him. The dispatcher spoke calmly and said that they would have a patrol team patrolling the area and monitoring the situation. She also said that it would be easy to identify an ice cream truck because it was very distinctive. Then she hung up. I was left in a state of confusion, not knowing what to do next. A while later, when my parents returned home, I told them the story while they ate the ice cream I had bought earlier. They were obviously worried, but at the same time reassured me that it was probably nothing serious. The confusion made me want to go to sleep, and I eventually fell asleep pretty quickly. But not long after, I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night around 3 a.m. Out of reflex, I picked up the phone on the nightstand. As I sat there trying to figure out what had woken me up, I suddenly heard music. The sound was so soft, so faint that it was hard to notice at first. But the more I listened, the more my tension grew as I realized that the sound was like music from an ice cream truck. Just as I was about to act, another sound rang out, a light tapping on my bedroom window. All the pieces of my mind clicked together. Someone had thrown a rock at the window. That must have been what woke me up. Paralyzed with fear, I just sat there staring blankly at the wall in front of me. Part of me told myself to get up and check, but every time I tried to move, my body froze. Finally, with every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to approach the window. I crept in, stepping aside, before mustering up the courage to pull the curtains open in one swift jerk. Before my eyes was the man who had stood in the middle of the front yard, right under the window, holding the hands of two small children. Judging by their short height, they looked like children, but it was too dark to tell. Without wasting another second, my heart pounding in panic, I immediately left the window and ran downstairs to wake my dad. I called 911 while my dad quickly went downstairs to check around. My dad was a tough guy and wanted to handle the situation himself. However, the man disappeared before we could do anything. The police arrived after a short search but found nothing unusual. A few days passed without any new information from the police or any suspicious leads. Life returned to normal and I finally had to go back to school. As soon as my mother mentioned it, my mind quickly returned to that fateful night. The two small figures standing next to the man in my front yard still haunted me, making my head spin. Why would he sit in my house for hours, then deliberately throw rocks at my windows in the middle of the night? It became even stranger when I learned that he was involved in a serious kidnapping. Was he worried that I had somehow discovered the truth? But if he was really involved in kidnapping children, the attention would be the last thing he wanted, and those children, I couldn't help but wonder if they were with him. When I first saw the truck that morning, I wondered if they could be somewhere else. The whole thing kept spinning in my head, leaving me with only one conclusion. People who kidnap children never act rationally. Maybe that's why he was so bold as to scare me. After the incident, my mother contacted the police to investigate the connection we might have with the case. If there was anything suspicious, this happened last spring, about 9 months ago. At the time, I was working as a salesperson for BMW, and my work schedule was quite busy. When I wasn't at the dealership, I still had to answer the phone for work, sometimes even busier than when I was actually working at the store. The nature of my job required me to answer the phone every time it rang, especially when it was from an unknown number, because it could be a potential customer or an important partner. One evening after 10 p.m., my phone started ringing with an unknown number that didn't show its identity. While I would normally pick up the phone without hesitation, this time I was relaxing in bed, so I let it ring without answering, thinking that if it was important, they would leave a voicemail. However, a few minutes later, the unknown number called again. This time I sat up and answered the call. Although I was a little annoyed at being disturbed at this late hour, I tried to keep my tone polite if they were serious. At first, all I heard was a strange, almost solid, unidentifiable static. I was about to hang up when I suddenly realized that underneath the noise was a familiar voice. My own. I brought the phone closer to hear it better and realized that the audio was a conversation I had had with a customer earlier that day. It contained the usual information about prices, inventory status, and test drives. Nothing sensitive. Still, hearing my own voice being played back made me shiver. Feeling a little confused, I decided to hang up immediately and sat staring at the phone, trying to make sense of the strangeness that had just happened. At first, I thought that maybe the customer had accidentally recorded the call for personal notes and called me again for some reason. But this thought did not explain why the call was from an unknown number instead of the number they had used to contact me before. The next morning, to clear things up and keep my wits about me, I decided to call the customer I suspected. This person answered immediately and maintained a friendly attitude as if nothing had happened. When I mentioned the strange call the night before, he seemed confused and had absolutely no idea what I was trying to say. Although his hunch told me that his explanation sounded quite reasonable. That night was when things really started to hit me. It seemed more intentional now, and I noticed something strange. The recordings contained only my voice, without any sound from the customer. It was like a one-way call. This made me wonder if someone was listening in on my conversations and recording them. I couldn't sleep that night because I was so worried, but I couldn't think of a way to deal with it. I had never considered myself paranoid, but the next week proved me wrong, as strange things happened every night. Every night I received calls from an unknown number and heard grainy recordings of conversations I had had that day. In my confusion, I decided to record my own calls. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I just thought it would help in some way. By the third or fourth night, it was starting to wear me down. Not just because of the indescribable fear, but because it was really messing with my thinking. I couldn't relax, couldn't shake the idea that someone was watching me. I found myself becoming more and more vigilant, glancing out the window every few minutes to check if anyone was there. I became more and more obsessive, locking the front door 3 times a night, leaving the lights on in all the rooms after dark, and even placing a chair in front of my bedroom door. Looking back, I can't explain why I did it, but my mind was in a completely different state. Even when the phone rang during the day, I would only go to my car to answer it because it was the only place that felt safe when I could see everything around me. It sounds crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Eventually, I decided to call the police, even though I felt ridiculous doing so. The police officer I spoke to politely listened to my story, but I could tell right away that they weren't taking it seriously. They said they would try to trace the number, but unless there was a direct threat or clear evidence of harassment, there wasn't much they could do. I still doubt whether they would actually look into it or just file it away and forget about it. In any case, calling the police wouldn't help, and it would only make me feel more alone in the situation. A few days later, the creepy calls suddenly stopped. Checking around and answering calls from my car all week long must have discouraged the harasser. Part of me wanted to believe it was over, but I couldn't relax. Strangely, when things went quiet, my paranoia and obsessions grew. My mother had schizophrenia, and I'd always told myself I might inherit that tendency. But it was too real to accept now. I was becoming a recluse, convinced that the world was watching my every move. I decided to change my phone number, and as complicated as it was, updating client information and resetting everything tied to the old number and potentially losing contact with some people, it was necessary. I couldn't help but think that my old number had somehow been compromised. But the peace only lasted a few days. I tried to stay calm that day, and instead of hanging up, I decided to speak up. I said something like, "I don't know who you are or why you're doing this, but if you need money, I can give it to you." I continued to say that I was willing to pay just to be left alone, even giving them my address and agreeing to meet. That was the first time I heard a real voice on the other end of the line. It sounded like they were using a voice-altering device, and all they said was 11-0 before hanging up. You might be wondering why I volunteered my address like that. Honestly, I can't answer that question either. I was acting completely irrationally, and I'm not sure why I acted that way in that situation. The 4 days after that call were the most terrifying and stressful times of my life. I don't know if I can go into detail, but here's what I did. I had a pistol in the house that I kept for protection. I took it out of my room, checked the ammunition, and sat in the kitchen waiting. The 4 hours I spent there were a jumble of thoughts dancing in my head. Even looking back, I can hardly describe what I went through that night. Fortunately, by some coincidence, I'm still alive to write this. Just thinking about that night makes me feel sick. At 11 p.m., no one had shown up. I don't know how I would have handled the situation if they had. I ended up falling asleep on the kitchen table with the gun in my hand. It was truly the worst night of my life, but fortunately, it was also the end. I never received any more strange calls, but that doesn't undo the psychological damage that person did. It took a lot of therapy and time off work to fully recover. Still, I shudder when I think about how easily I was pushed to the edge. I will never have answers for what happened to me. I don't know who that person was or how they got information about my life. I don't understand their motives for harassing me and then suddenly stopping. After the incident, I moved out of that house to start over. However, my world was no longer the same. The experience made me even more afraid of the future, and I couldn't help but worry that worse things might be ahead. At times, I was haunted by the fear that I would end up like my mother. I hope that sharing this story publicly can help me heal.